Merci pour l'invitation de le comité d'organisation. Pardon pour mon français, présenté in English. So thank you for everything. I apologize for my poor French. So we'll go from there. So my presentation today will be on influences of estrus on intensity and fertility in dairy cows. So a little bit, I started studying this topic about 6, 7, 8 years ago. When I left, I started my position at British Columbia. And I spent quite a bit of time in the looking at protocols, synchronization protocols, and all sorts of sync programs for dairy cows. At some point, and this is, I'm going to be pretty brief in this context here because I don't want to go into details of all these synchronization protocols that most of you are extremely familiar with. But the idea was that at that time, some of these activity monitors were starting to get more and more popular. In British Columbia, this is very true. Perhaps 70, 80, maybe 90% of the farms do use those activity monitors. Is mostly on freestall barns. And the idea was that why would estrus be important? I've been giving this talk quite a few times now. And before, when I studied most of the synchronization protocols, estrus was exactly what we tried to avoid. We didn't want to detect estrus. We just wanted to breed cows by time at AI. And, but eventually we started to look at data elsewhere, and there's basically two major points. One is what happens if a cow comes in estrus or not. Obviously, if you wait for the cow to come in estrus, just for spontaneous estrus, obviously you're not going to inseminate if it doesn't. But there are protocols around, that induce estrus. And sometimes you inseminate the cow anyway if it shows or not, and she ovulates, and we can measure things. The second part is this number 2, which is behavioral changes. And this is something a bit more recent because part of the actual quantification of these behaviors or this estrus intensity, as we're going to speak a little more during the presentation, really is done in a mass scale through sensors. It is very hard. On research basis, you can do it. You can make indexes, you can do visual detection and calculate, but that's really on small scale research settings that you can do it. You cannot really do it much in a large scale. So this activity line, and today we have even more. I'm going to show just a few to classify those estrus into high and low. But obviously today, all these sensors, we have rumination, feeding time, temperature, and you name it, lying time, of course. So all of these eventually can go into this sort of index of how you calculate, estrus intensity. This first slide is actually from a big experiment we did actually in Brazil. And the two things that you see is that, the first set of columns is time at AI. The second one, TET, is timed embryo. Well, it's embryo transfer, basically. In Brazil, we do use quite a bit of embryo transfer. And what we did, for those of you who are not familiar, Brazil still uses quite a bit of estradiol cypionate to induce estrus and ovulation. So instead of using GnRH, use estradiol cypionate for the sole reason that is very cheap. And the fact is, as opposed to GnRH, that most of you use quite often, ECP induces estrus behavior. And what you show here, all of this data is from cows that actually synchronized, ovulate, but some of them showed estrus, some of them did not show estrus. And what you see pretty clearly is that if you see pregnancy diagnosis at 32 days, at 60 days, on the time of the eye, 25 versus 38, 20 versus 33, and pregnancy loss is lower. If you go on the embryo transfer, it's the same trend. So estrus in itself is an indication of a more fertile breeding. Now, the reasons for that we're going to talk a little bit more. But this is basically saying a cow was detecting estrus either with visual detection or a patch or some other simpler type of estrus detection. The second part, and this is one experiment we did on also in beef cows, and what we did in this case, we started to go a little bit more basic, and we tried to retrieve the embryos. In this case, we retrieve embryos here at day 15 of gestation, but we did experiments with these day 17 of gestation, day 19 of gestation. And what we see is that those cows, and these we're talking about cows that even the ones that are pregnant, the ones that showed estrus and the other ones that did not show estrus. And one of the things that you can see is this conceptus length. And this conceptus length, it's not exactly very trivial to find out, what do you mean by length? And this is the actual embryo at that stage. It has 2.7 centimeters, and the non-estrus cows has 1 centimeter. It doesn't look like much at that point, but it's basically over twice the size. So this is basically how an embryo at that stage look like. It doesn't look like that embryo that we collect to transfer, and it really turns into this at some point. So this is about a little over about 20-something days. So that's the stage where placentation is occurring, all the maternal recognition of pregnancy, all these fancy words, the physiology goes. But the point is, these cows in estrus, they just have more robust development, on the embryo. So the second point then is the behavioral changes. And now we're going to go a little bit more from the very kind of basic of how it goes to more practical information that I hope at the end of the day it has a few suggestions and a few take-home messages to all of you. So this is estrus, and when I say here estrus intensity, by estrus intensity what I mean is, let's say, and this morning Elsa showed, more or less the number of steps that, for example, a cow makes or do it in a freestall barn, which is somewhere about 1,500 steps per day, and which is true. That's more or less what we find in our settings there. So this fold increase means that, if a cow is more or less on that 2 value, it means that at estrus, she walked about 3,000 steps. If it was 4 times, it's probably 6,000 steps, and so on and so forth. So the idea here is that this is basically a distribution. You have a bunch of animals that normally comes in heat, and they walk basically twice as much. And there is a bunch of animals that you see here on top of this graph that actually walks way more. And once we started studying some of these things, we're like, okay, that's nice. You walk more, good for you. But the point become that this information was all of a sudden associated with fertility. It was actually associated with some of those things that we've been studying perhaps during this past 6-7 years. So what we do have in practice is what? This is more or less what, and you can see any sort of graph. This is the kind of graph that you see in some of these activity monitors. And what you see in this little mountain here, this little bump, is normally when an animal is detecting estrus. So she's walking a certain amount of steps. The computer does the following. It calculates what it does in the previous 7 days. It calculates a rolling average. Eventually, you go 2-3 standard deviations above that step, and it goes, okay, this is an alert of estrus. So, and with that, we tried eventually to calculate this size of this bump. Okay, so we tried to go get the raw data and say how exactly we can calculate this. So this is more or less the distribution of intensity. Duration, and this is data from lactating cows. The previous one was from heifers, but is actually pretty similar in cows, in dairy cows, in lactating cows, sorry. So you have a distribution of most of the estrus. They go into like anywhere between 14, 16 hours as calculated. And we say, can we calculate that as well? So we started going over, instead of just using alerts and whatever the commercial product they gave us, we start to calculate raw data and start going bananas, you know, a little bit on, you know, what these numbers could mean, okay? So in this lactating vaches, that was good. So the pregnancy here per AI is this is the stuff that we tried to do. It was the following. This was the very first experiment we published back in 2015. As you can see here in this bottom axis here, the first graph on your left, what we do have is like the pregnancy per AI was very low when intensity was low and increased as intensity increased. So when you group them in terms of, you know, low, and we calculated more or less the medium value compared to the high, we had somewhere between 10 to 15 percentage units more, and this is a third more pregnancy rate in those cows that display very high intensity estrus. Okay, that was the very first study. Since then, since those studies in 2014 that we did, we probably run 10 more. And the idea is that I have never seen something more consistent than this. And we calculated, we separated, we put it in the model, milk production, body condition score, parity, you name it. And all of those trends continue to be. So this trend is very similar between primiparous and multiparous cows as well. And so there was something there. So we repeated this. I'll show a few more slides of other experiments that we did. This is an experiment we did with a German group, and we see the same thing. This we use like the SCR collar. The previous one, we used another one, a DDAP collar. So we also, and that is something that it gets more and more complicated because you're dealing with the different sensors that measure things in different ways and gives you information in different units. So eventually you have to dig into that a little bit to have a little bit more standardization there. This is another experiment we run in Brazil, and that was induced estrus, and we gave it ECP. So even when you give a lot of estradiol, which physiologically is what triggers estrus, you still have a difference on how cows behave. And if you can capture that, you do have the ones that have very high relative increase activity, they have better pregnancy rates. The most striking things, we did studies in BC, we did studies in Ontario, in Germany, in Brazil, and they all follow more or less the same trend in terms of the difference between high and low intensity. You have this 10 to 12% percentage units more, which is a lot when you consider you're talking about 30% preg rates, or 35% conception rate, 35% conception rates. Pregnancy losses, the same. As you increase activity, relative activity, you do decrease the pregnancy losses. And eventually when you have like 3-4 studies doing the same, you start kind of believing the data is real, and you start going a little bit deeper. So we took, I'll be the first one to admit that was not exactly something intuitive for me to say, oh, it's a behavioral thing that has such a good marker for fertility. But eventually we tried to go in that direction. So two more things, and these things are also all have practical applications in terms of if you can capture this kind of information, is something that you can do something about it. And I'm going to show at the end of the presentation something we did about this high and low estrus and how we could do it. But we did have we did 2 experiments, one with donor cows, one with recipient cows for embryo transfer, and we put those tags, those accelerometers, those sensors, and those animals that actually have greater intensity of estrus right after superovulation or right after they are synchronized to receive the embryo 7 days later. One thing that happens is that the donor cows, they provide you more structures and more viable embryos. We try to look into that now in BC with more detail, but we still have to prove the cause of it. But the association is there. The second part, those animals, and these are recipient animals. The previous one was donor cows. The recipient animals, or the animals that receive the embryo, If you can calculate how the estrus was 7 days before they received the embryos, the ones that actually displayed estrus and displayed more intense estrus, they were the ones with by far the highest fertility rates. In some farms now, when we go back even in Brazil, some of this information are actually used because it is an expensive technology. So if you can provide or synchronize more recipients, and those recipients that you synchronize are the really best ones, it's economically speaking makes sense. So the take-home messages from this first portion is basically estrus is indeed more important than we thought it was, maybe perhaps 10, 15 years ago. So the expression of estrus, our expression of a natural behavior, tends to be something important. In the next few slides, we're going to try to understand what is associated physiologically with that. So not all estrus are equal, of course. You have silent estrus, we have estrus with low intensity, you have some suboptimal cases in there. The intensity and duration does have a direct association with pregnancy per AI, pregnancy per embryo transfer, and pregnancy loss. So these are all kind of information that is pretty well established now. So the next one is the association with fertility, of course, we determined. The second one is the possible explanations. I'm not going to dive into all the possible explanations and all the experiments we did. We tried to look into all these factors that you see now in the slide: health, follicle and estradiol, the endometrium, or how the endometrium looks like, progesterone, and ovulation. So we're going to talk, and I'm going to summarize my things, only the last two topics, which is progesterone and ovulation. Some of the other things physiologically makes a lot of sense, it's pretty interesting data. But I think for this audience and how we can have some take-home messages, I think these two are the best. So progesterone, this is the one that interested me in the beginning for one reason. We all know from all other studies that high-producing cows, they eat a lot, they have a lot of clearance of hormones in their liver, and normally those high-producing cows, they just have low progesterone levels, lower estradiol levels than a dry cow or a beef cow. And the major reason is because they eat too much, long story short. So the idea to us was like, is there any association between these animals that have low estrus expression and high estrus expression? And what we found was that the profile of progesterone during the estrus cycle of these animals is indeed quite different. So what we did was we collect these sequential blood samplings, from these cows. And what you see here in these light gray bars is that, at the day of the alert, of the day of estrus, the progesterone is lower, significantly lower. And this is a good thing. This is the basis for any of you that have already tested double prostaglandin in some of your protocols. If you do that, the idea behind this double prostaglandin shot was exactly to lower this progesterone level at the day of AI, which tends to be very beneficial to fertility. But then after 7 days, 14 days, especially the 7 and 14 days post-AI, what you would like to have is more progesterone. Why? Because it helps, that tapeworm embryo that I showed before, it helps them grow the way it should. So in this case, the association, you do have better, progesterone profile, which is better for fertility. Again, this is not the cause. What we're doing now in our lab is to do everything that I'm showing to you as an association, and we're doing randomized trials. We're just imposing high progesterone, imposing low progesterone, and see what happens. So we're testing the hypothesis now. But this is a good thing. We found some good association on those estrus. What would be and why should we care about this? Possibly, and the nicest part we'll see at the end, is that if we do prove more and more that this behavioral marker, it is a really good one for fertility, perhaps we can develop, refine, and this becomes a good phenotype. This is a good phenotype for measuring that can be used not only for decision making at the farm, but also for example, as I will mention, genetic selection. Okay. So this is one of the previous experiments, and this one was actually we imposed treatments. The blue bars there, the blue graph, is what we would call like a high progesterone treatment. The other one, a low progesterone treatment. What we saw in terms of follicle size and how the ovary looks like is exactly what we would expect. And what we saw is that those animals in the high, or what we say here, the normal column, they have greater intensity of estrus. So we're starting to go, you know, that funky feeling I had about just having more steps and behaving a little more crazy during estrus. It has a foundational, a physiological foundation to it. So progesterone is perhaps the one that I think is the most. And then you can think, you know, for practical purposes, what do I care about this? Perhaps you can influence how the cycle, maybe hormonally, which is not probably preferential, but maybe you can start trying to get more information as how you can manage to have better cycles with better estrus and more fertility more often than not. Okay, so as I said before, the progesterone is actually here the major driver to set up cows for an adequate estrus expression. Again, although the title and a lot of what I've been doing, you know, this past few years, you know, estrus, I truly believe that estrus is just a consequence. It is just a marker that you have that. It's not necessarily the behavior will change or do anything to fertility. But estrus seems to be simply a display of a better cycle. And having a better cycle, you probably, when I say better cycle, profile of progesterone especially is better. And much easier to measure at a large scale. So with all the talk today about phenotyping and how you can do deeper phenotype in most of these animals, perhaps sensors and things that are easier to measure is much more attractive than collecting milk samples or blood samples or having to do something that is a bit more labor intensive. So again, it confirms the possibility to use as a marker for fertility. We are still unclear what is the ideal phenotype. And I'll explain later why I think is still in the works for that. The second one is one that also helps explain why those low intensity estrus cows, they behave worse in terms of fertility. The study, and we've done probably 3 or 4 or 5 of those, and they all more or less follow the same trend, which is cows in the high intensity or the low intensity estrus, they fail to ovulate more. Basically, they show estrus, but they fail to ovulate. Is this something normal? If you get in a population about 5 or 6% of your cows even showing estrus, they will fail to ovulate. And then you're going to have some that majority of cows read the book, so they showed estrus and ovulate. Some show estrus, do not ovulate. Some, even smaller proportion, do not show estrus and ovulate. And those that don't do anything. So, but the bigger point here is that you have a clear difference in ovulation rates between the two, which is timing. I didn't show the slide here because, you know, otherwise the organizing committee would kill me with the amount of slides I first sent. So, but the idea was that the timing also changes, and likely is another significant factor affecting estrus. So it creates a certain potential for intervention. And the third portion and the final portion then of the presentation is on these interventions. I skipped quite a few slides on some future on actually the reproductive programs, but we can talk about this a little later. But we did a very, very simple. Right after we did 3 or 4 experiments with ovulation rates that follow more or less the same trend, we said, let's try something simple. Let's start giving GnRH at the time of AI to some of these animals that show heat. Simply that. It didn't go any way around. I didn't had the intention to start implementing GnRH shots, for these estrus detecting cows. But what happened was that if these cows fail to ovulate for some odd reason, maybe they will respond. And we did it at AI because it was easy, basically that. So we split the cows. We created groups of high and low estrus intensity. So we would verify which animals went high or low in spontaneous estrus, and we would randomize them into yes or no GnRH. So we did in 3 farms in BC, and no surprise, another experiment in which we high and low have, and again with that sort of 10 to 12 percentage units difference between high and low. So these are cows that didn't receive GnRH, and they behave pretty much similar to the previous experiments that we did. The cows in the high increased slightly when we gave GnRH. In this case here, for this experiment, although 4 percentage units there, or 3.5 percentage units, is quite attractive, it was not significantly different. However, the low one increased quite a bit. So the point became that when we gave to all the cows, and this is what happens, the point here is this information is not exactly easy to retrieve. It's not the high and low estrus expression is not something that will pop into the commercial display of your sensor. But if you could do that, you could select a population of cows that probably have more fail a little bit more to ovulate, and they tend to respond a lot better to that GnRH shot. At the end of the day, for this experiment, and this is something that quite a few farms and one of the veterinary clinics that we work in BC has started to implement in commercial farms, is that obviously what they did, give it to everybody. Because you still had some increase in the high. So at the end of the day, they find something like a 4 percentage unit increase in those pregnancy or conception rates. And for them, it was enough to justify that shot AI, which was in practicality very easy to do. Okay, so you inseminate the cow, you give a shot of GnRH, and that was good. So this is one example of a practical intervention, something that can be used, that came from studies from behavior of the estrus expression from sensors that are today commercially available. So the take-home additional GnRH in detected cows in estrus does work. I think it needs a little bit more, I'll be honest, it needs a little bit more probably experiments there. We are trying to add more, to it. We do know that it doesn't work. We have done one big experiment in Idaho in some bigger farms, but those are mostly Jersey or Jersey hosting cross. They're not as high producing, of course, and the response is nowhere near similar to this. So there's something there that, I don't think is going to work everywhere. And apparently there's one study that just came out that also did not find the same rate or same change that we did. But I think, on the responses that we had from this experiment and from some of the farms around in BC, it seems to have some traction. Obviously, further studies on identification of selected populations, and this is the part that some other groups are doing some good work about selecting populations of cows that you could leave it to be inseminated in estrus, some others to be timed AI, but the whole purpose, at least in my program that we're doing, is that we're not trying to get rid of timed AI. We're trying to minimize timed AI, just simply for the sake of the point that we can keep high pregnancy rates, conception rates, at the same time that we can have less interventions. So some future topics, and this is something more to present, what we're trying to do with some of this data is, is obviously this, what we call the sustainable reproductive programs and genetic selection. I am now also working more and more with the health portion of these sensors. And these health portions, I think there is a little bit more to be researched, especially on the detection of diseases or prediction of diseases, as some of these sensors claim to do it. But the whole point is like this is a project that has a couple years ago has been granted to a large multi-province a program for selection, genetic selection, and the whole point is it includes the fertility side, which I lead, it includes the health side, and includes also methane emissions and feed efficiency. So the idea is that at the end of this big grant, we can try to put different indexes or a different index that includes everything. On my side, just to give you the point, what we're trying to do is, instead of the bullet number 2, we know more or less what happens. Bullet number 1, we have done studies showing if you come in estrus a little earlier and a little stronger, they do better. What we don't have is integration of all this data yet. So we don't know how one affects the next, that affects the next, and how intervals between them. And with that, the idea is that instead of using intercalving interval for reproduction selection or genetic selection for reproduction, we use something a bit more closer to biology, and perhaps something that we can also collect at a larger scale. So this is one, obviously quite a few challenges, to get all this together. And with that, I think I am done. So I would like to really thank all the sponsors throughout some of these years for these specific projects, and again thanking the organizing committee and all the attention from all of you. Thank you.